Okay, I'll just do the introduction. Yeah, it's okay. Shall we start? Okay. All right. Good evening, everybody. And my name is Chetan Subramaniam. I am a professor of economics, and I also happen to be the dean faculty here at IIM Bangalore. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this book launch ceremony for this book titled Media and Climate Change by my colleague, Professor Deepti Ganapathy from the communications area. So let me start off by introducing this very distinguished panel. It's my absolute privilege and pleasure to welcome our guest, Mr. Ricky Kej. He obviously needs no introduction. Of course, a two-time Grammy Award winner. His album Divine Tides, where he's collaborated with the legendary musician Stewart Copeland, won the Best New Age album at the recently concluded Grammy Awards 2022. Mr. Tej also won his first Grammy in 2015 for his album Winds of Samsara in the Best New Age album category also. He's also a strong conservationist and an environmentalist. Along with being a musician, he is an ambassador for several UN organizations, UNESCO, MGIEP, UNICEF, to list a few. He's also somebody who actually walks the talk. I was reading a whole bunch of interviews. I was doing my homework for this. And to quote him, he says, "I do not own a car and only use public transportation. I do not subscribe to fast fashion and only own 11 sets of clothes at a time and buy clothes that last a long time. I am a vegetarian. I also have carbon footprint, or my carbon footprint audited every quarter and offset by planting trees and investing in renewable energy." Yeah, the 11 sets of clothes I showed to my daughters. All right. Hopefully it has some effect on them. Okay. Of course, absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome our director, Professor Hrishikesh Krishnan, Director IMB, is Professor of Strategy, and one of the big thought leaders in the management space in the country. He's also a best-selling author. I know that he cares deeply about environment and sustainability issues and has championed several new initiatives at IIM Bangalore, which I'm sure he's going to talk about. So thank you, Rishi, for taking the time. And finally, the star of the show, Professor Deepti Ganapathy. She's a colleague in the communications department, and she's also the chair of the Center for Management Communication. So the book, once again, Media and Climate Change, I think it's timely and it explores the socio-economic and cultural understanding of climate issues and the influence of environmental communication via news and the public response to it. It's a really interesting read. I found myself really fascinated by some of the facts that the book presents. And one of the most interesting things about the book, of course, which I'm sure the panel is going to talk about, is the impact of climate change on the Western Ghats in India. As the book points out, the Western Ghats barely cover 5% of India's forests and are home to about 1,800 species endemic to the region. They also have 27% of all species of higher plants recorded in the Indian territory. I did not know that. And the book is filled with such interesting tidbits, and it's quite a fascinating read. Of course, it's received a lot of attention. And as you can see in the background below, both academics as well as the media has embraced it. I saw a lot of praise from professors from University of Michigan, George Mason University, and so on and so forth. So congratulations, Deepti. It's really a job well done. So today's discussion is going to be on climate change. I think it is certainly the defining issue of our time. As I was walking up for this event, I just was browsing over news items on my phone, And I saw a BBC headline, which talks about the fishermen in Western India. Said we spend hours at sea, but there's no fish. And I quickly read through the story. It says things like, between 1951 and 2015, the surface temperature of the Indian Ocean has increased by 1 degree centigrade in the equatorial region. And what this has done, I mean, this is just an example, is that it's sort of warmed the waters. It's affected the reproductive behavior of fishes. It's caused cyclones, flooding, and, all sorts of issues. So it's, climate change is no longer some abstract concept that is discussed in the halls of universities. I think it's affecting day-to-day lifestyles, particularly in our part of the world. So without further ado, I'm going to request the panel. I think the way the discussion is going to proceed is that we will invite each of the three speakers to come and give their opening statements, and then we'll take and we'll have some questions for them, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So, Mr. Kej, can I invite you to meet? Thank you.
Yelrigu namaskara, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for having me, rather. So, the book Media and Climate Change is a very important book because at the end of the day, whenever it comes to any kind of issues that we are facing, especially environmental issues and issues that are so wide, communication becomes really, really important, and effective communication is what solves these problems in a large part. So I'm a musician, and I started off my career doing commercials for television and radio. And in the span, I started off my career in 1999, and in a span of about 13 years, I did more than 3,500 commercials for pretty much every brand imaginable, whether it's Google or Microsoft or Airtel or Vodafone or TVS or Suzuki, basically every brand and their competitor anywhere in the world, I was composing music for them. And after doing this for 13 years, it sort of struck me that these big brands have understood the power of music, that they've understood the power of music so much so that they're ready to spend a couple of $1,000s on a person like me to actually create a piece of music for them, to actually sell something, because they're always trying to sell something. And not only that, they're ready to spend a few $1 million to actually air this music on television and radio, because they have fully well understood that music is not only a powerful language for communicating a message, but also for retaining that message deep in the consciousness of a listener. Like, for example, the songs that we learned during our childhood are songs that we never forget. And if there are any morals in those songs, those morals pretty much dictate our lives, because that's how effective music is as a communication tool. So that is when, around 2013, is when I decided that I'm going to stop all forms of commercial music, not going to do any kind of film music or Bollywood music or item songs or, or commercials for television and radio or brands. And every single piece of music that comes off my fingers or my head or my studio is going to be an extension of my own personality. It's going to be an extension of my own beliefs and philosophies and things that I want to communicate to the world, basically in my own tiny, small way, trying to make this world a better place through my music. And that's what started off a new journey of mine that, of course, I'm continuing now and will continue to continue. So now, with all the problems that we face in our world, starting with climate change, because that's pretty much the biggest existential threat we are facing as human beings. But in addition to that, you have things that sort of are interrelated with it, like species extinction and deforestation, plastics pollution, air pollution. And then, of course, you've got a whole lot of society issues like gender inequality, poverty, hunger, water, sanitation, education. There's so many issues that we face. I believe that the biggest threat to us as a species, as human beings, is the constant thought that we have that somebody else will make a difference. We're always waiting for governments to make a difference, for intergovernmental bodies, for NGOs, for leaders, for corporations to make a difference. When the truth is that the only way we can actually bring about change is if we bring about small, tiny, incremental changes within our own lives. And the reason why we don't do this is not because we are all some sort of evil people. It's because somehow the systems around us have failed us, because they've made us believe that they've not empowered ourselves enough to make us believe that the small, tiny, incremental changes that we make within our own lives can actually make a difference. We always like, if I do this, or if I stop using single-use plastics, then what difference is it going to make, Or if I reduce my consumption of fossil fuels, what difference is it going to make? It's all up to the governments and everything like that. So I believe that we need to empower ourselves, most importantly, and everyone around us, to believe that the small, tiny, incremental changes that we make within our own lives can actually make a huge difference and are actually really important. And how do we do this? Now, science is the most important aspect over here, because scientists are the people who tell us what are the problems that we are facing and also give us proper solutions, or at least lead us to the solutions. But you can show to the common person, like, for example, me, you can show me a ton of scientific data and it'll probably not make any difference in my life. You can make 1,000 speeches to me, it'll probably not make a difference. But what is needed is for artists and for communicators and for media to actually translate these complex ideas and thoughts in the simple language which people can understand, especially in a more emotional language, through storytelling, through effective communication, through music, in my case, so that it reaches the hearts and souls of people. And that is what will encourage people to bring about change, because people need to have an emotional response to these issues. So that's why I would say that communication is extremely important, and that's what we need to lead towards, effective communication. And right now, when it comes to climate change, everything is all over the place, that people talk about everything from polar bears in the North Pole to plant species going extinct, to animal species going extinct, to health issues. There is such a wide array of communication that all of this needs to be consolidated. All of this needs to be easy to understand. And for any person who believes that climate change is an issue, or feels that climate change is an issue, there can be some easy steps for them to incorporate within their own lives so that they can bring about a change. And that's how effective the communication needs to be. So with that, I close my opening statements. Thank you.
Professor Krishnan.
Yeah, hi, good evening. Let me first congratulate Deepti on the South Asian edition of her book. I think the international edition came out some months ago, and you've already heard the extracts of the reviews. Certainly, it's a very timely book. There's no doubt about that. So if you look at this whole issue of media and climate change, clearly, as she has brought out well in the book, it's a pretty complex issue. So let me just look at a few different aspects of this. One is, of course, we know that the whole question of what the media pays attention to is itself a pretty challenging question. We know that the media tends to cover issues which catch the public attention. We know media is also largely organized as a business, and therefore media is driven by its business model. And therefore, there is a certain inherent bias which creeps into the way media covers a whole variety of issues. And right from Noam Chomsky and many others, people have captured pretty well what are all the biases that go into the way the media selects what it covers. So this is a very high-level problem, and we know this covers all areas, whether it be politics, whether it be society, whether it be what's happening in our locality, and so on. So I think that's issue number one. Issue number two is we also know that when it comes to people's behavior and decision-making, it's quite difficult to influence people when the gap between cause and effect is quite large. When things are very proximate to each other, it's simpler to influence behavior. But when there's a whole chain of intermediate events and the cause-effect relationships are not clear, then it becomes all the more difficult to have any kind of influence on people. This reminds me of a case study I read many years ago, where I think it was P&G was trying to market a product which was a small powder, which was put into water to kill bacteria, and which was, I think, largely being sold in countries where clean drinking water was not available. But many people couldn't see the immediate connection between clean water and whatever it is, malnutrition and health problems and so on. So in many countries, they just were not able to sell that product for a price. And ultimately, they converted that into a CSR campaign rather than continuing to try to sell it as a commercial product. And once again, this is something we see all the time. For example, the importance of health, sanitation and sanitation's connection to health is something which, once again, it's not a very visible cause and effect relationship, and therefore often very important steps for sanitation which people should be taking get missed out. So I think this is a second issue, and this is particularly an acute problem for climate change, because we know that the whole process of climate change, first of all, is quite distant from many of the day-to-day actions that we take. There are changes happening, but how do we relate those to our own behaviors is something which is beyond most of us. So when you combine all of this together, when you realize that there are these challenges on observing cause and effect relationships, in any case, the media is driven by a whole lot of other agendas. It's not very surprising that media's response to climate change is the way it is. It's rather spotty. It suddenly comes up, then it kind of goes away, and one doesn't hear about too much attention being paid to climate change for months on end. Then some other sensationalist thing comes up, or some IPCC report comes out or something, and again for 1 or 2 days it's in the news, and then once again it sort of goes away. So the good news is that people like Deepti have done a good job of capturing a lot of these challenges. If you go through her book, you will find that whether it be about what's happening in the Western Ghats, which Chetan already referred to, or whether it be some of the other issues at a higher macro level that are happening in climate change, what has been the media narrative, how it's changed over time. She has some nice comparative studies between how different media houses have covered similar issues, and she's got some explanations for the differences. So it's all useful in terms of understanding the connection between media coverage and all the events that are happening around us. So I must compliment you, Deepti, on putting all of this together so nicely. And of course, there are lessons for all of us on how we need to perhaps widen our sources of information beyond what the media packages and delivers to us if we want to be better informed on such issues. Of course, beyond the media, we do have others. I mean, when I was reading her book, I was also thinking of some of the recent works of authors like Amitav Ghosh, who have tried to, in a very graphic way, capture what are going to be the impacts of climate change. So I think there are others who are trying to fill in for the gaps in the media, but certainly we have our work cut out as far as understanding climate change and having a media that's more sensitive to all the changes that are happening around us. So once again, congratulations, Deepti.
Professor Kanya.
Yeah, so I just wanted to tell a small story about the thought behind this book. And I think it began at Ricky Kej's concert in 2017 in the seat of the Karnataka government, Vidhan Sauda. So here he was with his whole, troupe of composers from all over the world, talking about the effects of climate change in Kiribati Island, in different parts of the world, bringing in voices from there, and talking to people who matter, that is the government, and telling them that, this is how policy impacts livelihoods, communities. And that was something which was very, very unique, I thought, of taking a whole concert into Vidhan Sauda and beaming it loud to the people that be there. And from there, my journey really began to then to the archives of those 2 newspapers that I looked at and saw what were they reporting about. Could I put them into themes? Could I look for frames within them? And then landed up in the communities on the fringes of the forest in the Western Ghats. So that was my journey, actually. So I started from policymakers, then I went to media, and then I went to the readers or the communities that were affected. And then I looked at the interlinkages between these three. And that's how the idea for this entire research project really shaped. And I was just reading this book recently about how the river Rhine shaped the socio-political or cultural and historical landscape from Switzerland to the Netherlands. And I think for us, River Kaveri is that, right? I mean, it's literally that the river that caters to a lot of communities and then reaches the Bay of Bengal. So also how young people engage with this issue. And I mean, I've been talking to a lot of different groups, whether it is the youth, whether it is scholars or policy analysts. And I feel that today the young people are very, very articulate, they are savvy, they're engaged, they're critical about this problem, and that they know how to also manage this on social media when they see these issues being covered on social media. And we see a lot of digital activism amongst the youth also when it comes to climate conversation. So I thought, that was something that, I mean, from when I did my research to now, there's this whole transition. There's a lot of change that has happened in this conversation. And that is something that's really, really interesting. Also, we still see these headlines today, like Dutch farmers are angry as their government goal is to drastically reduce emissions of nitrogen dioxide because they want to, call this as an unavoidable transition because they have to reach their goals. So then this conflict that's going to arise. We earlier spoke about the man-animal conflict. Now there's going to be conflict within communities, within different sectors of the government itself, or not the government, in society itself. And a lot of questions were really pointing to the direction of why does media coverage matter? I think last week, this time, we had the Minister of External Affairs talking at this very place, and he talked about why democracy matters, or how democracy, has brought out or not brought out changes in our country, but because he's seen the transition in the Southeast Asian countries. And I think in a democracy like ours, the media is the fourth estate. We call it the fourth estate. It's the fourth pillar after the executive, legislature, and the judiciary. The media still has the power to enable conversations. It still has the power to, bring about these changes. In a democracy like ours, it is necessary for the media to be bringing out the voices of these marginalized communities who are affected because of climate change. It's necessary for them to project government policies and what impact it has on communities. And I think that's why the media's role is crucial. And that's where I kind of try to bring my argument in.
Thanks, Deepti, for that. So I guess I'll direct this question to Ricky. When you look at the media coverage, particularly in the West, when I look at what you deal with these climate skeptics, when I listen to CNN, I get a certain message. When I turn to Fox News, the story looks very different. So, I mean, can you talk about some of them? And given that you've been so active in this space, I mean, can you talk about some of the challenges that you face in dealing with climate skeptics? How do you use music to sort of
So there are two aspects to this. One is, of course, since you talked about the United States of America, that's a very unique case because unlike anywhere else in the world where climate change is treated like a science, over there it's treated more like a religion, where probably just like how you would believe in God or not, you believe in climate change or not. And whereas everywhere else in the world, it's a proper science, it's a science that, you either agree with the science or not, but there it's more about belief, it's become part of the belief system. So that's why I've always through my concerts and through my engagements, and I do a lot of concerts in America, and all my concerts are about the environment and about climate and things like that. That's the only thing that I actually perform about. In fact, in March itself, I did a 9-city tour over there. Now, the thing is that I try to remain as far away from controversial topics as possible. So what I do is that I talk about it, that whether you believe in climate change or not, I don't say it in these words, but the idea is that whether you believe in climate change or not, the principles of mitigating the effects of climate change is all about responsibility. So whether you believe it or not, it's good to be responsible. It's good to reduce your consumption of single-use plastics. It's good to reduce your dependence on fossil fuels and things like that. So I talk about everyday things that people can do. Now, the second aspect to this is basically how does one communicate to a general audience? Now, this is something that I've coined. There are two ways. One is the Greta Thunberg approach, and the second is the David Attenborough approach. So that's how I've classified it. Now, the Greta Thunberg approach is all about doom and gloom and shaming people into action, which is also very effective. It's very, very effective, but in a short term. It's in my opinion, it does not have long-term effects as being effective, but in the short term, it's very effective. But at the same time, it's got a negative aspect to it too, because most people, when they are scrolling on their social media and they see gory images and images of animals dying and things going bad, then they end up like switching off, or they end up scrolling a little quicker, to pass that picture. So that is the negative part of it. Then you have the David Attenborough approach, which is more about inspiring people into action, because pretty much every single conservationist on this planet, has a story about how Sir David Attenborough has, influenced them in some way to become a conservationist and to love, the natural world. So that is about inspiring into action. And as the Senegalese philosopher Baba Diom said, that at the end of the day, and this goes to what you mentioned earlier, that at the end of the day, we as human beings will only protect things that we love, and we will only love things that we understand. We'll only understand things that we are taught. So I believe that, positive reinforcement and getting everyone to fall in love with the natural world, and hopefully through that love, finding it within ourselves to protect, to conserve, and to sustain is a more long-term way, because you're actually inspiring people into action and also encouraging people to think as a species. So as you said, sir, that we only care about things that are immediately around us. But if our actions are responsible for sinking islands on the other side of the world, and those people have no fault when it comes to climate change, we do not care about that, So, but at the end of the day, we have to start thinking as a species, and we have to start thinking beyond our own circles. So yeah, to answer your question, that's what it's basically. It's always a debate between having inspiring people into action or shaming people into action, both of them being effective, and also treading sensitively and with a lot of empathy with people who do not believe in climate change. So the thing is that it's not about telling them that, it's not about going aggressive against them. It's about telling them that I hear you, I hear you. But at the same time, probably what you're saying is right. But the principles of what we're talking about, is not wrong, like in the sense that you just have to be more responsible, and all of us have to work together. That's it.
Thanks, Ricky. So Deepti, I'll direct this question to you. So in your book, you talk about climate change is notoriously a difficult subject to report on. And this is something that, I also feel when I read media reports, because a lot of it is based on scientific journals, but there's the term uncertainty, and I think this is something that you talk about in your book also, is used a lot. And uncertainty for me means the evidence is not completely there. So can you elaborate a little bit about, why is it a subject that is so difficult to report, particularly from a media perspective?
Yeah, because I started with that polar bear, and the polar bear, I end my book also with that imagery of the media using the polar bear 2 decades ago to talk about climate change. And at that time, the polar bear was something very distant, far away. The Arctic pole was very far away, and it was already an endangered species. So why do we even care about something that's happening to us so distantly? And that was how the media chose to project, climate change or global warming, as they called it at that time. And so what were the effects of those? It's not to be felt unless it's happening closer home. So when I went and spoke to these communities in the Western Ghats and asked them, what's climate change for you? And I could get a sense of it through a lot of focus group discussions that I did with them. But then they would say, for us, climate change is when it's raining very heavily in Bangalore and the roads are flooded and those images are repeated on all TV channels to us. That is climate change. And the irony was that the indicators for them were so close home. They could, I could just tell them that you haven't heard the fox for a long time. Your children don't even know what the fox call sounds like. You don't have enough of gooseberries to sustain yourself in the wild. And those are more the indicators for climate change for you than heavy rain or heavy downpour in a city, the capital of the state, where traffic is coming to a standstill. So unless, the reader feels that or experiences climate change himself or herself, it's very difficult to make them feel that it's happening for real. And I think news organizations today have also understood this. And so they are making it more interactive. Like you have heat maps where you can feel, how it's going to feel in my own city 20 years from now, or you can experience that. And so they have started making it more interactive. And so when I started talking about my book at different US and UK universities, I found that scholars are increasingly engaging the media or content generators in the space of weather or climate change to understand what's happening in the research side and helping them to contextualize it and position it for a practitioner sense. So that's what for instance, the George Mason University is doing. They have this newsroom project where they involve a lot of journalists. And we try to do something that last week as well at IIM Bangalore, when on World Environment Day, we invited senior journalists who are covering environmental issues. And you can see their bylines. They write a lot about environmental issues. And when we did that one-day program for them here at IIM Bangalore, the main feedback for them was, we don't see the impact of our work. We feel so frustrated because we are covering the environment. We are the voice for the environment, but we can't see that impact. And you are telling us that policy makers are reading, they are making decisions based on what we write. That's very heartening to know, but it's going to take a lot of time for us to feel the impact. Whereas I told them 50% of news today crime is dominated by politics. They're saying because the impact is so quickly visible for us. Like we cover a crime news and the criminal is caught and he's, we feel that we've achieved something by bringing that to the notice. But how long can we, get into this aspect of reporting about the environment and not being able to peg someone for it, not being able to keep someone accountable that, because of this policy decision, the whole of this, so, like 20,000 villages got submerged, or, there's not enough food for those people there. So how do we see the impact of that? So there was a lot of disillusion in that group that we spoke about. But I'm happy that, we've started this conversation and, beyond this book, we can make an impact through these continuous engagements. And we're also next trying to, rope in Indian Forest Service officers and different stakeholders in this dialogue and kind of, keep these engagements going. So that's something that we are looking forward to.
Thanks, Deepti. So Rishi, this is for you. Climate change risk is real, and companies are grappling with it. It's hitting the top line and the bottom line. The unseasonal floods in Southeast Asia, for example, are disrupting supply chain networks. Tech companies now worry about costs caused due to overheating of servers, for example. So from a business school point of view, for us to remain relevant, the curriculum must sort of reflect some of this. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on how management schools are dealing with it. Do you see these discussions about these risks being reflected, for example, in curriculums or in cases and things like that? Or do you think we need to do more? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think one thing that's happening for sure is there is increasing realization that all the issues you just mentioned need to get better coverage in the business school curriculum. Of course, as in many other issues that cut across functional boundaries, covering these issues in a typical business school curriculum is a challenge. We are looking at that in various ways. We have for several years now been highlighting the sort of macro level issues of climate change in a course like Business, Government and Society, which is a required course for our MBA students. So we have one session which is devoted to understanding the broad connections between different elements that finally contribute to climate change and so on. But of course, that's just one session in one course, which is one of several in the MBA curriculum. Another dimension, I think, which we have been trying to cover off and on is the whole issue of bringing sustainability discussions into operations management and supply chains. In general, there has been a view that there is, in fact, a commonality between environmental concerns and efficiency, in the sense that when you improve efficiency, it also, in a way, helps the environment. So that's been a part of the discussion in OM and in supply chain, I think, for some time. And even in strategy, which is the subject I teach, we have been talking about this as part of the strategy of the organization as well. I think it's really become more stark and more evident in the last decade or so. And perhaps the decisions taken by some industry leaders, I would particularly mention the CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman, who took a pretty courageous step in about 10 years ago in saying that Unilever will embrace several climate change related metrics in the way they run their business. And if this means, that they have to take other trade-offs in their performance, so be it. There have been other business leaders who have followed that track. I think in India, companies like ITC have been focusing on triple bottom line for several years now. So a little bit of that is also in our curriculum. I think there are other challenges, though. I think one of the challenges is how do we make this very practical? One thing I did try in IIM Indore when I was the director was to make a very practical sustainability course part of the core of the MBA curriculum. And faculty were quite receptive to that. It is a short course. I think it was just 5 sessions, but it focused on pretty much the bread and butter of sustainability, things like water conservation, energy conservation, and how you can address those issues in a very practical way. So the course had very little of big theory and perspective, but quite a bit about, on a day-to-day basis, how do you track these and try to address these issues. We certainly have a long way to go. I think about that, there is no doubt. As I mentioned a little earlier in my remarks, I think one of the challenges is that something like climate change at the high level, but even sustainability and ecological sensitivity at a more practical level cuts across different functions in the business management curriculum. And traditionally, we have not been, I must confess, very good at addressing issues that cut across like this. What's a related issue is ethics and governance, which we have been talking about for years and years, but we still don't have very good solutions to what is the best way to cover ethics and governance in the curriculum. But of course, this doesn't mean we should not be trying harder. I think the one thing we did discover in our curriculum review, the latest one that we did last year, was that many of the companies are paying much greater attention, not just to climate change by itself, but to this whole ESG piece. So the environment, social and governance issues looked at the collective are increasingly becoming prominent in CEOs' agendas. And therefore, this needs to filter into our curriculum as well. So in the latest curriculum review, we did flag this issue, and we have encouraged all the different functional areas to take this into the curriculum. But I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of detailing it out and making sure that all those connections do happen. So yeah, I think that's broadly where we stand on management and climate change right now.
Thanks, Rishi. I think, Ricky, this is for you. There's a bunch of questions from the students. They more or less the flavor seems to be the same. How can we as consumers of information and news get involved in climate action?
That's a difficult question because there are many things that one can do. So one has to find their own path to figure out. One is that, of course, changing your own, bringing in sort of incremental changes within your own behavior, or propagating the news through social media and all of that stuff. But then again, I'm a little confused over here because social media can be a double-edged sword, because one can also spread misinformation and spread information that is quite sensationalized at times. And so basically, yeah, that is a confusing question. But I would say everybody needs to find their own path and figure out things. But first, with the easy things that you can that people can do within their own lives, I think that would be more important rather than trying to change the world. If everybody can just figure out how to bring about changes within their own lives, that would be a great way. Like simple things, as I mentioned earlier, single-use plastics, dependence on fossil fuels. In India, a huge problem is there with public transportation, simply because there's a stigma attached to it, that once I have a car, I cannot move backwards towards public transportation. That needs to change. That stigma needs to change. So that's what I've been trying to change within my own life, and trying to do that by example. I travel by whenever I can. I travel by BMTC buses. I travel by the metro train. So that way, when people see me doing that, that I try and I post pictures of that on social media, showing that that it's cool to do that. And when we go out of the country, we figure out public transportation systems, and we do that. And why not do that in your own city, where it's the easiest to learn how to do that? So that. And then, as I mentioned about fast fashion, something that I had done was that this year at the Grammys, when I'd won the Grammy, I wore a certain costume, and it would be considered a complete fashion faux pas if I wore that exact same thing again. And when I walked the red carpet at the Cannes Film Festival last month, I purposely wore the exact same thing. And then after that, when I went to Stockholm Plus 50 and I performed there, I wore the exact same thing again. So I wore them 3 times. I put that on social media, and I said that, it's perfectly good to wear the same thing again and again. And, just buy good quality clothes and constantly, repeatedly wear them again and again, and don't subscribe to fast fashion. This whole paradigm of, that every Instagram picture has to look different and has to have a different costume. So I guess these kind of things can be quite helpful, to change these ideas and these thoughts which have just come into our society quite recently, and be more responsible in that way.
So this question is for you, Deepti. Is there anything unique about Indian media and how we can leverage it to discuss climate change?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because I didn't think about that till I started talking to different audiences in the US and UK when my book released in November. And there was such a wide interest in the way in which the Indian media covers it, because climate change is going to affect the Southeast Asian region quite drastically, and it's going to be seen in different ways, mass migration and a lot of different ways. And so when the media in these countries is predominantly talking more about crime or politics, how are they going to be covering these issues, or are they having the expertise really to cover these issues, becomes interesting. So what is unique about the Indian media is that the Indian media is of course controlled or dominated by the big corporates today, but there are also these community radios. There are also these smaller media organizations that are struggling to stay afloat, but they still believe in the power or the freedom of speech and expression, and they want to continue to do so. And I think it's these voices that will continue to get amplified and that will continue to matter because they have their audience, they have the content, and they know how to co-produce news. And I think this possibility of co-producing news is going to come to the fore because audiences want to get involved. It's no longer one-way directional flow of communication. Audience wants to get involved, and they want to feel the effects of their involvement. The uses and gratification theory that we talk about. So they want to be involved and they want to feel the effects of it. So I think the Indian media is unique in that sense.
Could I add a little bit to that?
Oh,
Yeah.
sure, please.
So one of the reasons why I feel this book is really important is that, when it comes to the Western narratives, and I attend a lot of these UN conferences all over the world, and the Western narratives are like, almost like a one size fits all when it comes to climate change. So it's all about consume less of everything. Let's make a better world for our children and our children's children. But then if you look at a place like India, and I've traveled extensively across India to understand the effects of climate change, to understand environmentalism and, been especially to tribal belts across India, also collaborating with tribal musicians and folk musicians. Now, the thing is that what I believe is that in India, there are two kinds of problems, widely classified. There's survival problems and there are thriving problems, So climate change, whether it's right or wrong, that's immaterial. But climate change is considered by and large to be more of a thriving problem rather than a survival problem. So if you go to a person who's living in poverty in a rural area and you tell that man or a woman that let's make a better world for our children's and children and our children's children, they're going to just turn back and they're going to scream at you. And if you tell them consume less of everything, because there's climate change around the corner, they're just going to get angry. So the thing is that the narratives have to be different. The solutions need to be local. That's extremely important. And one needs to understand and have empathy, for people who are facing the worst effects of climate change, because more often than not, it's not their fault at all. So I think these things need to be kept in mind when it comes to communication, that, it cannot be a one size fits all approach. And Deepti spoke about, community radio. These are very, very powerful mediums for actually communicating communicating effectively to the right audiences and to every audience.
Okay. So I think we are almost out of time. So any last thoughts, Rishi? Maybe start with you on your takeaways from the book.
Let me just think. So one thing that, I think was mentioned in the discussion, and I think this is something we need to really look at. This is this whole question of how do you take a very complex subject like climate change and make it part of the media narrative? We know from several years of looking at the media that and I think Deepti mentioned this in her earlier comments, that the media generally prefers simple stories in which for example, the hero, the villain, all of these are clearly identifiable. There's a story and, all this stuff, and it can be easily just portrayed in this way. But often climate change does not lend itself to such easy characterization. Many of as we've discussed, the effects are complex, they're at a distance, there are multiple factors. The climate models are incredibly complex, they're full of statistical jargon, uncertainty, everything. So how do you really present all this complexity in a simple way? And I think the only way the media will pick it up and report it on a consistent basis is if we can find ways of simplifying the narrative and making it a little more amenable to fit in the paradigm that the media follows. So I think that, at least for me, that's one of the challenges for people in the communication business.
Ricky?
So climate change obviously requires a ground-up approach and a top-down approach, and that's really important. And the media plays a very important role in both aspects, in my opinion. And when we spoke, I spoke a lot about the ground-up approach, but when it comes to the top-down approach, there are obvious things that need to happen at a policy level, which of course are easier said than done because it's pretty much impossible in the world that we live in. One is, of course, that any brand without exception or any corporation without exception, if they are going to be profitable by going against the environment and by going against nature, they're definitely going to do that. That's the bottom line, because at the end of the day, profits is very most important. So it needs to be made extremely expensive for companies and for brands to work against the environment. So that is one thing. The second thing is that, again, easier said than done. So I'm just speaking my mind out. The second thing is, of course, there needs to be a complete freeze in destruction of the environment, in cutting down, deforestation and destruction of nature. There needs to be an absolute freeze of that, whether it's all over the world or whether in our own country, that needs to happen. And the third thing, which is the most important, is education. So that needs to start at a primary school level where things are taught from the perspective of the environment, because if you look at it, sustainable development has become a huge buzzword nowadays. But inherent to that term, it's a sustainable development. There's something very wrong intrinsically, because development from time immemorial has always meant developing together, where everything and every life form basically benefits. But right now, we as human beings have hijacked that word. And when we think about development, we think about New York skyline, we think about paving of roads, we think about construction, deforestation, building a railway line in the middle of the forest. That's what we think about development. And so that's why we've got a different term called a sustainable development, which is more responsible development. So basically, we need to reclaim that word development and make that into sustainable development and have a different term for unsustainable development. And that can happen only through the education system, where a new generation of human beings are taught that, that this is the way we need to live in coexistence with all life and with the elements of nature. So I think, that would be my closing statement. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Sir and Ricky have pointed out on two very different and interesting aspects. I would like to take it up in this context that the youth of today should not get into this concept of eco-grief. Increasingly that word is being felt. They're feeling overwhelmed by what's happening with climate change, by the doomsday narrative. So that eco-grief should not set in. They have to get into a space where they think about climate action, get into that space where they think of themselves as climate warriors, build on what knowledge base has been passed on to them, and take up take it up forward. I think it's up to them now how they are going to lead us going forward. And my only concern is this, that they shouldn't be feeling overwhelmed by this discussion, and therefore the media should think about using them in co-producing that news, using them to, targeting them in the way in which they report, and involving them in this process, because the youth matter, and what they think about climate change matters more than anything else at this point in time.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot. At least my takeaways were, focus on local issues, make this more a grassroots movement, simplify the narrative, and keep it positive rather than a doomsday scenario. So thanks a lot. Very engaging discussion. And now I will request Professor Deepti to release the book officially.
Like
Thank you for making this simple and making it a tough job to open the
I'm using plastic.
You can close the cover.
Thank you.
Just one fundamental prediction.
Oh, nice.
This goes into the 12th setup.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming.
My pleasure. It's an honor. Thank you. Only so many of you.
Yeah, I'll.
Return your original work.
Thank you.
We're not adding so much. Yeah. Carbon footprint.